Today's video is a detailed review and analysis of the movie Greenland 2, Migration, starring Gerard Butler. This is not a full movie and not a movie screening. In this video, we will break down the complete story of the film and explain how the plot develops from start to end. We will talk about the main cast and supporting cast, their roles, and their performances. We will also cover the movie's production, development process, and the creative choices behind it. You will learn where the story was inspired from, who wrote it, and what the original idea and purpose were. Along with the creative side, we will analyze the movie's budget, box office performance, and overall business results. Every important element of the film is explained and reviewed from a viewer's perspective. So let's begin and take a closer look at Greenland 2, Migration. Greenland was no longer the quiet, pale blue it once used to be. Strange electromagnetic storms rippled across the atmosphere like violent waves of invisible energy, lighting the clouds with flashes of unnatural green and violet. Inside the underground bunker near the ruins of Thule Air Base, the remaining survivors had built a fragile version of civilization, clinging to routine and hope. 5 years after the devastating Clark comet shattered the world, John Garrity walked through the narrow metallic corridor of the bunker with the tired posture of a man who had carried too many responsibilities for too long. His job as a scout meant he often left the safety of the underground facility to explore the broken surface world. Each mission exposed him to radiation and unpredictable environmental disasters. But without scouts like him, the bunker community would never know where resources or safe zones remained. In the central command room, Allison Garrity stood in front of a flickering map projection, showing the unstable global conditions. Over the years, she had grown from a frightened survivor into one of the leaders of the bunker community. Her calm voice and strong judgment kept the survivors organized while the outside world continued to collapse. Their son, Nathan, now a teenager, watched everything with restless curiosity. The boy who once depended on insulin and protection had grown into someone desperate to prove he could survive like the adults. Every time John prepared for another scouting mission, Nathan watched him with admiration and impatience, hoping one day he would be allowed to join the dangerous expeditions. The bunker suddenly trembled with a deep, violent rumble that shook dust from the ceiling panels. Earthquakes had become common since the comet impact altered the planet's tectonic balance. But this one felt different. The shaking intensified, metal supports screeching as if the entire underground complex was slowly being crushed by the earth above. Sirens screamed through the bunker corridors as emergency lights flashed red. Engineers rushed toward control rooms, while terrified families grabbed whatever supplies they could carry. Allison's voice echoed through the loudspeaker system, ordering everyone toward the evacuation tunnels leading to the surface lifeboat docks. John rushed toward his family through the chaotic corridors, pushing past frightened survivors. The floor cracked behind him as another violent tremor shook the entire structure. Concrete debris rained down while the overhead lights flickered wildly, threatening to plunge the bunker into complete darkness. Nathan struggled to keep up as Allison guided him toward the escape route. The boy's heart pounded with fear, but also excitement. This was the first time he had seen the bunker's carefully organized survival system fall apart. The world he had grown up in was collapsing once again. They finally reached the evacuation chamber, where dozens of survivors were boarding armored lifeboats designed to survive ocean disasters. Dr. Amina, one of the bunker's most respected scientists, shouted instructions while helping injured people climb inside the vessels. Just as the Garrity family climbed into one of the lifeboats, a thunderous crack echoed through the cavernous bunker chamber. The ceiling above the docks collapsed, sending massive slabs of rock crashing into the water basin below. Waves surged violently, smashing smaller boats against the steel walls. The lifeboat doors sealed shut as the automated launch system activated. Powerful engines pushed the vessel through the escape tunnel, toward the open ocean. Behind them, the entire bunker complex collapsed into the freezing waters of the Arctic coast. As the boat surfaced into the violent gray sea, the survivors witnessed the full destruction of their once safe refuge. A monstrous tsunami wave surged across the coastline, swallowing the remains of the bunker and everything around it. Years of survival planning disappeared beneath the roaring water. For a long moment, nobody spoke inside the lifeboat. The last stronghold of organized human life they knew had vanished within minutes. All that remained was a handful of survivors, drifting across a devastated planet. After days of dangerous travel through unstable waters, the survivors finally reached the ruined coastline of Liverpool. The once great city stood like a graveyard of civilization, its broken skyscrapers leaning at unnatural angles, while abandoned ships rusted in the harbor. Groups of desperate survivors roamed the streets, searching for food and shelter. Many had formed armed factions that guarded territory fiercely, unwilling to trust outsiders. The Geraghty family quickly realized that surviving in this new world required constant caution. While trying to locate another rescue bunker rumored to exist beneath the city, the survivors were suddenly caught in a violent firefight between rival groups, battling for control of the entrance. Bullets echoed through the empty streets as chaos erupted around them. John pulled his family behind a collapsed wall, while the gun battle raged across the ruined square. Several of the Greenland survivors were killed in the crossfire, their journey ending just hours after escaping the bunker collapse. Forced to flee the city, the remaining survivors continued traveling south toward London. Along the way, they passed endless fields of destruction, where forests had been burned away and rivers ran dark with radioactive sediment. When they finally reached London, the city appeared strangely quiet compared to Liverpool's violent chaos. Small survivor communities had established temporary shelters inside underground subway tunnels and reinforced buildings. The Geraghty family spent several days recovering there, gathering supplies and information from other survivors. Rumors circulated among travelers about a miraculous region somewhere in southern France where life was beginning to recover. According to scattered reports, the massive impact crater left by the Clark comet in the Mediterranean region had somehow stabilized the surrounding environment. Radiation levels were lower there, storms were rare, and farmland had begun to grow again. For the first time in years, the idea of a future seemed possible. Many believed that humanity's best chance of rebuilding civilization existed near that crater valley. John studied the reports carefully, realizing that reaching the crater would require crossing the dangerous wastelands of England and France. The journey would be long and deadly, but staying where they were offered little hope. With determination burning in his eyes, he made the decision that would change everything. The Geraghty family would travel across the ruined continent toward the crater, chasing the possibility of a new beginning. Nathan looked at his father with a mixture of fear and admiration as the plan formed. The boy knew the journey would be dangerous, but he also understood that the future of their family depended on reaching that distant safe haven. The wind that swept across the abandoned highways of southern England carried a strange metallic scent, a lingering reminder of the radiation storms that had scarred the planet for years after the comet's destruction. John Geraghty moved carefully along the cracked asphalt road, scanning the horizon through a pair of worn binoculars, while the small group of survivors followed behind him in cautious silence. Every step across the ruined countryside reminded them that the world had become unpredictable and hostile, where even the calmest landscapes could suddenly erupt with danger. Nathan walked beside his mother Allison, carrying a small backpack filled with medical supplies and survival gear. He tried to imitate the calm confidence of his father, but the endless silence of the empty countryside unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Fields that once grew crops were now covered with gray dust and twisted metal debris, while abandoned vehicles rested along the roadside like skeletons of a forgotten civilization. Dr. Amina followed close behind them, occasionally stopping to examine the strange environmental changes around them. Her scientific curiosity had never faded, even after years of disaster, and she constantly studied the soil, the air, and the strange electrical disturbances flickering across the sky. She believed that understanding these changes might help humanity survive the unstable planet that remained. As the group continued traveling south, the distant skyline of Dover slowly appeared through the hazy atmosphere. The once famous coastal city had become another silent ruin, its harbor filled with broken ships and collapsed docks. The English Channel beyond it no longer looked like the deep blue water that once separated nations, but instead resembled a vast desert of cracked earth and shallow salt flats. The sight of the dried channel stunned Nathan, who had only heard stories about the ocean that once existed there. Now the seabed stretched endlessly toward the distant horizon, shaped by powerful winds that carved dunes of white salt and sand. The catastrophic geological changes caused by the comet had drained entire seas, turning them into barren wastelands. John studied the open terrain carefully before leading the group down into the exposed seabed. Traveling across the empty channel would be dangerous, but it also offered the fastest path toward France and the rumored safe region near the impact crater. If the stories were true, the future of humanity might exist somewhere beyond that endless desert. The first few hours of walking across the dried ocean floor felt surreal. Rusted shipwrecks rested on the sand like ancient monuments, their hulls split open by years of corrosion and violent storms. Strange skeletal remains of sea creatures were scattered across the cracked ground, reminders of the once thriving ecosystem that had vanished. Nathan climbed briefly onto the tilted deck of a massive cargo ship that now rested on dry land. From that vantage point, he could see the endless wasteland stretching toward France. The scale of the environmental destruction made him realize how much the world had changed since the comet struck. As night approached, the group set up a temporary shelter beside the rusted hull of another ship. The metal structure offered some protection against the cold winds. Sweeping across the open channel, a small fire flickered between them while they shared the limited food supplies they carried. For a brief moment, the journey felt peaceful, but that fragile calm was suddenly shattered by distant gunfire echoing across the desert-like seabed. John immediately extinguished the fire and signaled for everyone to remain silent. Armed scavenger groups often roamed these wastelands, hunting travelers for supplies. Through the darkness, several vehicles appeared on the horizon with dim headlights bouncing across the cracked terrain. The engines roared louder as the convoy approached, clearly searching for something or someone in the open wasteland. The Garrity family hid behind the massive shipwreck while the vehicles passed dangerously close. Nathan held his breath as the armed scavengers scanned the surrounding area with flashlights and rifles. The tension lasted several agonizing minutes before the convoy finally moved away into the darkness, leaving the survivors shaken but unharmed. At dawn, the group resumed their journey across the exposed channel, pushing themselves to move faster before more scavengers appeared. The harsh wind whipped across the barren landscape, carrying swirling clouds of salt dust that made breathing difficult. After an exhausting day of travel, the distant ruins of Calais finally appeared ahead of them. The French coastline looked almost identical to the English side: collapsed buildings, abandoned ports, and empty streets haunted by silence. Yet the sight of land still brought a small sense of accomplishment to the exhausted travelers. As they cautiously entered the outskirts of the ruined city, a group of armed locals suddenly emerged from behind the broken walls of an old warehouse. Their weapons were raised, but their expressions showed more curiosity than hostility. Survival had forced people to become cautious, but not everyone had become violent. A tall man stepped forward and spoke cautiously in broken English, asking where the travelers had come from and why they had crossed the dangerous wasteland. John calmly explained their journey from Greenland and their search for the rumored safe region near the comet crater. The mention of the crater immediately changed the mood among the locals. The French survivors exchanged quiet glances, as if the story carried deep meaning for them. After a tense moment, the man finally lowered his weapon and gestured for the group to follow him. They were led into a small fortified village hidden among the ruins of Calais. Unlike the chaotic settlements they had seen before, this community appeared organized and peaceful. Small gardens grew between collapsed buildings, and children played under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Inside one of the reinforced buildings, the group met a French family who had been helping travelers reach the southern territories. The family explained that many survivors had already begun migrating toward the crater region, believing it offered the best chance for rebuilding civilization. The family also had a request. Their young daughter Camille had dreamed of seeing the safe valley near the crater, but they could not risk traveling through the dangerous war zones that surrounded it. If the Garrities were willing, they asked that Camille be allowed to join their journey south. Allison looked at the frightened yet hopeful girl and felt a familiar surge of compassion. After everything their own family had endured, leaving the child behind in the ruined city felt impossible. John nodded quietly, understanding what his wife was thinking. Camille joined their group that evening, bringing with her a small backpack and a quiet determination that reminded Nathan of himself when he was younger. Though the world had collapsed around them, hope still survived in small acts of kindness and trust. You're now looking at the Jungfrau in the Swiss Alps, standing at 4,158 meters. It's one of Europe's most iconic snow-covered peaks. From here, you can admire glaciers, valleys, and lakes, an unforgettable panoramic view. Riding the cogwheel train to the top of Europe is a once-in-a-lifetime experience, whether hiking in summer or skiing in winter. This is a paradise for nature lovers. The countryside looked nothing like the fertile farmland it once had been. Entire forests had burned away during the impact years earlier. leaving behind blackened tree trunks that stood like silent monuments across the gray landscape. Occasionally they passed the remains of collapsed villages, where rusted cars and broken houses told the story of people who had tried to survive the chaos. Nathan carried a small map that had been given to them by the survivors in Calais. The paper was worn and marked with rough directions, showing which areas were controlled by military forces and which roads were believed to be safer. Even with the map, however, every step into the unknown territory felt dangerous. Camille stayed close to Allison, quietly observing the unfamiliar world around her. She had never traveled far beyond the ruins of Calais, and the vast destruction beyond the city felt overwhelming. Yet the thought of reaching the safe valley near the crater gave her a fragile sense of hope. Late in the afternoon, the group reached the edge of a once busy highway that had collapsed in several places due to earthquakes. Massive cracks split the road apart, forcing them to carefully climb across unstable concrete slabs. In the distance, faint sounds of artillery echoed through the air, signaling that they were approaching the military conflict zones surrounding the crater. John paused at the top of a ridge, overlooking the ruined highway. Through his binoculars he could see smoke rising far across the valley where military forces appeared to be fighting for control of the territory ahead. The journey was becoming more dangerous with every passing mile. Despite the growing threat, the group continued forward. They traveled through quiet forests where the trees had slowly begun to grow back after years of environmental chaos. Small animals moved through the brush, a sign that nature itself was slowly recovering, even while humanity struggled to rebuild. As night approached, they found shelter inside the remains of an old farmhouse, standing alone in the countryside. The roof had partially collapsed, but the stone walls still provided protection from the cold wind sweeping across the fields. They gathered inside while a small fire crackled softly in the darkness. John sat quietly, while examining the medical scanner they carried. For several days he had been feeling increasingly weak, and the device confirmed what he had already suspected. The radiation exposure from years of scouting missions had slowly begun damaging his body. He kept this information to himself, unwilling to burden his family while the journey remained unfinished. Allison noticed the exhaustion in his face but said nothing. After surviving so many disasters together, she understood that strength often meant continuing forward even while carrying hidden pain. The mission to reach the crater valley mattered more than anything else now. The following morning they resumed traveling before sunrise, hoping to avoid the roaming bandit groups that often attacked travelers during daylight hours. The road gradually climbed into a mountainous region, where narrow passes twisted through rocky hills, scarred by earthquakes. Halfway through the mountain pass, the group suddenly heard the sound of approaching engines. Several armored vehicles appeared on the road behind them, moving quickly through the narrow canyon. There was no time to hide. John quickly guided everyone off the road and behind a cluster of massive boulders as the convoy approached. Soldiers wearing improvised armor and carrying heavy weapons jumped from the vehicles, scanning the area with suspicion. Their uniforms suggested they were part of one of the many military factions fighting to control access to the crater. The tension lasted for several long minutes while the soldiers searched the surrounding terrain. Finally, one of them spotted movement near the rocks where the group was hiding. The soldiers raised their weapons and demanded that the travelers step out slowly, with their hands visible, realizing resistance would only lead to violence. John calmly walked forward and explained that they were refugees, trying to reach the safe valley near the crater. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances before lowering their weapons slightly. Their leader, a stern officer named Lieutenant Blake, studied the exhausted travelers carefully. He explained that the military forces guarding the crater had been fighting off constant attacks from bandits and rival groups, trying to seize the fertile land inside the valley. Anyone approaching the region without permission was treated as a potential threat. After a tense conversation, Blake finally agreed to escort the group closer to the front lines, where their commanders could decide whether to allow them to continue. Though the situation remained uncertain, it was better than being turned away or attacked. The convoy continued deeper into the mountains, passing through defensive checkpoints where soldiers guarded barricades built from destroyed vehicles and concrete walls. The scale of the military operation showed just how valuable the crater valley had become. Soon the distant sounds of explosions grew louder as the convoy approached the active battlefield. Smoke filled the sky, while artillery shells thundered across the hillsides. The road ahead led directly toward the heart of the conflict. Nathan looked out the vehicle window with a mixture of fear and determination. For years he had dreamed of reaching the place where humanity might finally rebuild its future. Now that dream stood just beyond the chaos of war. The convoy stopped at a fortified command outpost overlooking the battlefield. From there, they could see the vast crater valley in the distance, surrounded by defensive walls and guarded by hundreds of soldiers. Green farmland and clear lakes shimmered under sunlight inside the protected valley, creating a sharp contrast against the devastated wasteland surrounding it. For the first time in years, the Geraghty family saw undeniable proof that the rumors were true. Somewhere beyond the battlefield lay a place where life had returned to the earth, but reaching that safe haven would require surviving one final and dangerous passage through the war that guarded its gates. The battlefield stretched across the valley like a storm of steel and fire. Explosions shook the ground as artillery shells slammed into the rocky hillsides surrounding the crater region. From the command outpost, the Geraghty family watched soldiers rushing between defensive walls while armored vehicles moved through thick clouds of dust. Lieutenant Blake guided the group out of the transport vehicle and toward a reinforced bunker where military officers coordinated the defense. Inside, maps covered the walls, showing the constantly shifting battle lines around the crater valley. Every few minutes, new reports arrived about attacks from bandit armies trying to break through the defenses. A tall officer wearing a worn combat jacket stepped forward to greet them. General Sharp studied the exhausted travelers carefully before speaking. He explained that the valley behind the defenses had indeed become the center of humanity's rebuilding efforts, but protecting it had turned into a brutal war. According to Sharp, thousands of survivors from across Europe had been migrating toward the crater after hearing rumors of fertile land and stable weather. Many came peacefully, but others arrived with weapons, hoping to take control of the new world that was slowly forming there. The general listened quietly while John described their journey from the destroyed bunker in Greenland. The story of their survival impressed several of the officers in the room. Still, allowing strangers inside the protected valley was not a simple decision. After a long discussion, Sharp finally nodded. He agreed to allow the Geraghty family and Camille to travel with a supply convoy that would be heading toward the inner defensive lines later that day. If they could safely pass through the battlefield, they would be granted entry into the valley. For the first time since leaving Greenland, hope began to feel real. The convoy departed shortly before sunset. Several armored trucks carried food, medical supplies, and fuel toward the soldiers defending the outer perimeter of the crater. John and the others rode in the back of one of the transport vehicles as it slowly rolled across the scarred battlefield. Smoke drifted through the air, while distant gunfire echoed across the hills. Burned-out vehicles and shattered artillery cannons lay scattered along the roadside, silent reminders of how fiercely people had been fighting to reach the valley. Nathan stared through a small gap in the truck's metal wall. In the distance he could see the massive crater itself rising like a dark ring across the horizon. Beyond it, green farmland stretched across the valley floor, glowing softly under the fading sunlight. For years the world had been nothing but destruction and survival. Now, just a few miles away, a new beginning seemed possible. The convoy moved cautiously along a narrow road, cutting through the battlefield. Soldiers standing in the back of the trucks kept their weapons ready, constantly watching the surrounding hills for signs of ambush. Suddenly, the lead vehicle screeched to a halt. A violent explosion tore through the road ahead, sending debris flying through the air. Bandits armed with stolen military weapons burst from hiding among the rocky slopes, firing wildly at the convoy. Chaos erupted instantly. Bullets slammed into the armored trucks, while soldiers returned fire from every direction. The peaceful hope that had filled the convoy only moments earlier vanished beneath the roar of battle. John pushed Nathan and Camille down to the floor of the truck, while Allison helped the wounded driver behind them. Outside, gunfire echoed across the valley as the convoy fought desperately to break free from the ambush. One of the bandit trucks smashed into the side of the convoy, blocking the road and trapping several vehicles in place. Armed raiders rushed forward, shouting and firing as they attempted to capture the supplies. John grabbed a rifle from one of the fallen soldiers and stepped out of the truck despite Allison's protests. Years of protecting his family had taught him that sometimes survival required facing danger directly. He moved carefully between the vehicles, firing toward the attackers while helping the remaining soldiers hold their defensive line. The battle raged across the broken road as explosions shook the surrounding hills. In the middle of the chaos, a sudden gunshot echoed louder than the rest. John staggered backward as the bullet struck his side. The world seemed to slow as Allison rushed toward him through the smoke. Soldiers continued fighting around them, while the bandits slowly began retreating under heavy resistance from the convoy guards. Nathan knelt beside his father, his hands shaking as he tried to stop the bleeding. John forced a weak smile, despite the pain spreading through his body. The convoy finally pushed through the ambush and continued moving toward the crater, leaving the defeated bandits scattered across the battlefield behind them. But the victory came at a heavy cost. Inside the truck, John lay quietly while Allison held his hand. The medical supplies were limited, and the radiation sickness already weakening his body made the wound even more dangerous. Through the open rear doors of the vehicle, the valley beyond the crater slowly grew closer. Clear blue sky stretched above green farmland and shining lakes where survivors had begun rebuilding homes and communities. After years of darkness, the sight looked almost unreal. Nathan helped his father sit up slightly so he could see the valley approaching. John's tired eyes filled with quiet satisfaction. Every step of their long journey had been about protecting his family and giving them a future beyond the ruined world. Now that future was finally within reach. The convoy crossed the final defensive gate and rolled into the peaceful farmland inside the crater valley. Soldiers and workers moved between growing crops and newly built homes, while clean water flowed through irrigation channels across the fields. It was proof that humanity had not been completely destroyed. The truck stopped at the edge of a quiet hill overlooking the valley. Allison and Nathan helped John down from the vehicle so he could stand for a moment and look at the place they had fought so hard to reach. Warm sunlight touched the green fields while fresh wind carried the scent of growing crops through the air. For the first time in many years, the world felt alive again. John slowly sank to the ground as his strength faded. Allison knelt beside him, while Nathan held his father's hand tightly. John looked at them both with quiet pride. He had kept his promise. His family had reached the new world. And as the sun slowly set over the valley, John Garrity closed his eyes, knowing that Allison and Nathan would now live in a place where humanity could begin again. The ground trembled again, stronger this time, and a massive crack tore through the concrete wall of the bunker. People ran through the dark corridors carrying small bags and frightened children. Somewhere behind them, a heavy steel door collapsed with a deafening crash. John turned back for a moment, watching the home that had protected them for 5 long years slowly fall apart. The bunker lights flickered and died, leaving only the weak glow of emergency lamps. He knew if they waited even a minute longer, none of them would make it out alive. Outside the bunker entrance, freezing wind howled across the ruined Greenland landscape. Snow, mixed with ash from old impact fires that still burned far away in the distance. The survivors hurried toward a small lifeboat station built for emergencies. Allison counted the people as they arrived, her voice steady even though fear was written across every face. Years of survival had made her a leader, someone people trusted when chaos returned. But today even she wasn't sure if they could escape this disaster. Suddenly the ground split open behind them, and the bunker collapsed completely. A huge cloud of dust exploded into the sky as the underground base disappeared beneath tons of ice and rock. Everyone stood frozen for a moment, realizing their only safe home was gone forever. John helped Nathan climb into a small metal lifeboat tied near the frozen shore. The cold wind cut through their clothes while waves crashed violently against the ice. Several survivors quickly untied the ropes and pushed the boat into the dark water. Dr. Amina jumped aboard with a medical bag, while 2 engineers started the small engine. It coughed loudly before finally roaring to life. The boat slowly moved away from the ruined coast as another earthquake shook the ground behind them. From the water they watched a massive wall of ocean rise near the collapsing base. Within seconds, a giant tsunami swallowed the entire facility, washing away the last sign of human life in that frozen place. Silence filled the boat as everyone realized how close they had come to death. Days passed as the small lifeboat crossed the cold Atlantic waters. Food was limited, and every night the survivors took turns watching the dark horizon for storms of floating debris. Nathan spent most of his time staring at the endless gray ocean. John quietly checked his radiation meter again and again when no one was looking. The numbers slowly climbed higher every day, and he knew what that meant. But he forced himself to smile whenever Nathan looked at him. Allison noticed the tired look in John's eyes, but didn't ask questions yet. She had learned that sometimes hope was the only thing keeping people alive. For now, reaching land was all that mattered. One morning, thick fog covered the sea as the lifeboat drifted closer to the British coast. Broken buildings slowly appeared through the mist, like ghosts from another world. Rusted ships floated near the shoreline, abandoned long ago. Liverpool, one of the survivors whispered, while pointing toward the ruined harbor. The boat finally touched the shore, and everyone stepped onto land carefully. The city was silent, except for the wind moving through shattered streets. It felt like walking through the bones of the old world. As they moved deeper into the city, they saw signs that people still lived there. Small fires burned in metal barrels, and strange symbols were painted on walls. Someone was watching them. Suddenly, armed locals appeared from behind broken cars and collapsed buildings. Their faces were rough and suspicious. Survivors who had learned not to trust strangers. Guns pointed directly at the newcomers. Allison slowly raised her hands, showing they meant no harm. She explained that they were refugees from Greenland, looking for the safe zone, rumored to exist in southern France. The leader of the locals studied them silently, before lowering his weapon. That night, the group was allowed to rest inside an old warehouse. A small fire warmed the room while the wind howled outside the broken windows. Nathan sat beside John quietly, sensing something was wrong. John's hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves. The radiation burns on his skin were becoming harder to hide. He quickly covered them again, before anyone noticed. Across the room, Allison watched him carefully. Her heart filled with fear because she already understood what John was trying to hide from everyone. The next morning, the journey continued toward London. The survivors walked through endless empty roads surrounded by ruins of the old civilization. Cars rusted where they had stopped years ago, during the first comet strikes. Nathan tried to imagine what the world looked like before everything was destroyed. His parents had told him stories about crowded cities and bright lights that never turned off. Now the world felt quiet and broken. Despite the destruction, small groups of survivors sometimes appeared along the road. Some traded food or information, while others simply watched silently from a distance. Trust had become rare in the new world. In a destroyed village outside London, tragedy struck suddenly. A group of desperate bandits attacked the travelers while they searched for supplies. Gunfire echoed through the empty streets as everyone scrambled for cover. Dr. Amina tried to protect a wounded survivor, but was shot during the chaos. She collapsed beside a broken wall, while John rushed to help her. Blood quickly spread across the dusty ground. With her final breath, she told them to keep moving toward the crater in France. She believed that place truly held the future of humanity. Then her eyes slowly closed forever. The group buried Amina near the ruins before continuing their journey. No one spoke for hours as they walked away from the small grave. Another good person had been lost, in a world already full of death. John's condition grew worse each day, but he refused to stop moving. His only goal now was making sure Allison and Nathan reached the safe land across the sea. Far ahead, beyond the destroyed cities and empty roads, the last hope of civilization waited near the giant crater where the comet had once struck the Earth. The barren English Channel stretched before them, a windswept wasteland of cracked earth and salt-encrusted soil. What had once been rolling waters was now jagged rock and shallow puddles, reflecting a sky heavy with ash and gray clouds. Nathan clutched Allison's hand tightly, the wind threatening to tear his small scarf away as John carefully led the way across the jagged terrain. Every step was a challenge. Rocks shifted beneath their feet, and hidden fissures opened suddenly, forcing John to catch both Allison and Nathan before they fell. His breathing grew labored, each step sending a sharp pain through his chest, but he forced himself to focus on the path ahead. In the distance, a crumbling bridge offered the only possible crossing to the far side of the channel. The steel beams were twisted and bent, remnants of a world that no longer existed. Yet John judged it safe enough to traverse with care, guiding the small group, one by one. Halfway across, a low rumble vibrated through the cracked ground. Dust rose around them as another minor earthquake shook the channel floor, splintering the bridge further. Nathan screamed, and Allison clung to him, her voice calm but tense, as she reassured him they would survive. John's hands shook slightly as he braced himself against the bridge, his body pushing through exhaustion and pain. He forced Nathan to keep walking steadily, one careful step at a time, while keeping his eyes constantly scanning for loose metal or sudden cracks. Finally, the three of them reached the other side, collapsing onto the dry, windswept soil in relief. John's chest heaved as he looked back at the bridge, now partially collapsed, realizing how narrowly they had escaped yet another death. Their journey continued toward Calais, navigating through towns stripped bare by disaster. Skeletons of cars and buildings lined the streets, and wildlife had begun to cautiously reclaim the roads. Occasionally, they encountered survivors, some cautious, others hostile, but everyone was searching for the same thing: safety. At night, they camped in abandoned barns or beneath fractured rooftops, always alert for dangers both human and environmental. John's strength dwindled, the radiation sickness eating away at him slowly, but he refused to show weakness. Every sunrise was another chance to keep Allison and Nathan alive. Camille, the young French girl they had taken in, grew increasingly quiet. She had lost her parents to bandits, and was learning quickly that trust was scarce. Yet she clung to the Garrities, seeing in them the only semblance of family she had left. One evening, as the group rested near the outskirts of Calais, a sudden ambush shook their fragile calm. Bandits leaped from the shadows, weapons raised and eyes wild with desperation. Shouts echoed across the barren fields as the Garrities scrambled for cover. John immediately moved to protect Camille and Nathan, drawing the attention of the attackers. Bullets whizzed past, embedding themselves in walls and ground around them. Allison grabbed what little supplies remained and pulled the children to safety behind a ruined stone wall. In the chaos, John was hit in the shoulder. Pain seared through him, but he refused to fall back. Fighting through the wound, he managed to fend off 2 attackers, buying precious seconds for the others to escape. The remaining bandits eventually fled, realizing the family was tougher than they anticipated. The next morning brought frost and silence. John's wound had worsened overnight, and Allison finally saw the toll the journey had taken on him. She bandaged him as best she could, but it was clear that he was deteriorating. Nathan watched silently, too young to fully understand, but aware that his father was fragile. Despite the danger and fatigue, John insisted they continue toward the crater in France. He knew this was the only place left that could guarantee a future. Allison reluctantly agreed, guiding the group onward as John leaned on her for support. The barren fields eventually gave way to low hills and cultivated farmland that survived the comet's devastation. Signs of life, animals grazing. Small crops offered a flicker of hope to the weary travelers. Approaching the crater region, they encountered French survivors who welcomed them cautiously. A family named Laurent offered temporary shelter, sharing food and warmth. Camille's parents had been friends of the Laurents, and the reunion was bittersweet, as Camille found temporary comfort in familiar faces. Over shared meals, the survivors exchanged stories of survival and loss. The Garrities learned that the crater had become a hub for humanity's attempts to rebuild a rare pocket of fertility and protection in a world otherwise scarred by catastrophe. The journey toward the crater was far from over. Military checkpoints, sporadic bandit attacks, and treacherous terrain awaited them. John, though weakened, insisted on leading the way, knowing that every step brought them closer to safety. Crossing the final stretch toward the impact site, the family felt a strange mix of exhaustion and awe. The crater's rim rose sharply, encircling a valley that seemed untouched by the chaos surrounding it. Green fields and freshwater lakes glimmered in the fading light. John paused, letting Allison, Nathan, and Camille take in the sight. For the first time since the comet struck, hope seemed tangible. The world they had fought to survive in was not perfect, but it was alive and capable of sustaining life once more. John's legs gave out as he reached the edge of the crater. He smiled weakly, knowing that despite his own failing health, he had led his family to a place where they could finally start again. His sacrifices had not been in vain. The Garrities cautiously stepped into the crater valley, each footfall a reminder of the long and perilous journey they had endured. The air was crisp and clean, free from ash and the lingering radiation that had plagued them for years. Birds chirped tentatively from the trees, and small animals scurried among the undergrowth, signaling life reclaiming the land. Allison took a deep breath, letting the sensation of safety wash over her. Nathan ran ahead, eyes wide with wonder, marveling at the green fields and the glimmering lakes. Even Camille allowed herself a small smile, her past losses momentarily forgotten as hope filled the space around them. John moved slowly, leaning on a walking stick he had fashioned from a branch. His body was weakened by radiation, exhaustion, and countless scrapes and bruises, but his spirit remained strong. He scanned the horizon, ensuring no danger lurked, determined that nothing would harm his family now. The family set up a temporary camp near the edge of the lake. Allison unpacked supplies with care, dividing rations evenly, while John surveyed the area for potential hazards. Nathan and Camille explored nearby woods cautiously, learning to identify safe paths and avoid sudden drop-offs or unstable ground. Night fell quickly, and the valley was bathed in a soft silver light from the moon. John shared stories of the world before the comet, of cities and oceans, of ordinary days that now seemed like distant dreams. Nathan listened intently, realizing the weight of survival and the fragile beauty of the new world they had found. As stars dotted the sky, Allison whispered to John that this place, this crater valley, was more than just a haven. It was proof that humanity could endure, rebuild, and adapt. John nodded silently, feeling a sense of fulfillment even as his body continued to weaken. Days turned into weeks as the Garrities began to integrate with the small community of survivors already in the crater. They cultivated crops, repaired buildings, and shared knowledge of survival tactics. The valley, though isolated, was proving fertile and sustainable. John taught the young ones about basic engineering, making sure they understood how to maintain shelters and wells. Allison organized daily routines, balancing resource management with safety drills. Nathan and Camille became familiar with the land, learning to forage and fish under careful supervision. Despite lingering grief over lost friends and family, there was a sense of renewal. Every task completed, every meal shared, strengthened the bond between the survivors and their environment, reinforcing the fragile yet resilient nature of life in the crater. Tensions arose as newcomers arrived, other survivors from distant regions seeking shelter. While most were grateful and cooperative, some challenged the Garrity's guidance and leadership, creating subtle conflicts. John and Allison navigated these tensions with diplomacy, ensuring unity without compromising safety. Nathan observed these interactions closely, realizing that survival wasn't just about avoiding danger, it also required understanding human nature, compromise, and empathy. Camille, too, grew stronger, slowly overcoming her traumatic past, through connection and purpose within the community. The Garrity's leadership became central to maintaining order, balancing the needs of individuals with the collective good. Their past experiences in Greenland and across the European wastelands had prepared them uniquely for this role. One morning, as mist lifted from the lake, scouts reported unusual seismic readings. Small tremors shook the ground, remnants of the comet's long-term environmental impact. John, though weak, immediately set out with a few others to investigate, fearing potential landslides or structural failures in the valley. They discovered that a nearby ridge was destabilizing, likely due to lingering radiation and tectonic instability. John directed efforts to reinforce the soil with makeshift retaining walls, combining his engineering knowledge with the labor of able-bodied survivors. Allison organized supplies and emergency shelters for the community, ensuring that everyone had a safe space in case of collapse. Nathan and Camille assisted, learning quickly under pressure, their youthful energy and agility invaluable in moving materials and alerting others to hazards. Every hand contributed, and the valley slowly stabilized under coordinated effort. The Garritys reflected one evening by the lakeside, watching the sun dip below distant hills. Allison rested her head against John's shoulder, feeling the weight of their journey and the fragility of life. Nathan skipped stones across the water, laughter mingling with the soft sounds of nature, while Camille collected wildflowers, placing them gently in the camp. John knew his time was limited. Radiation and exhaustion had taken their toll, and while he had brought his family to safety, the future would soon demand leadership from the next generation. Allison silently acknowledged this truth, understanding that their story was one of endurance, and that the torch must eventually pass to Nathan and the younger survivors. As night settled over the crater, the lake mirrored the stars above. The Garritys, surrounded by the whispers of wind through trees and the distant calls of wildlife, felt an unusual peace, a reminder that even after catastrophe, life could not only survive but flourish. The valley had been quiet overnight, almost unnaturally so, with no birdsong and a stillness in the air that made every rustle of leaves sound amplified. Nathan rubbed his eyes and peered toward the horizon, sensing that their serene refuge might not remain untouched for long. Allison gathered the remaining survivors to conduct a morning check of the perimeter. They walked in organized groups, examining each fence, fallen tree, and uneven ridge, ensuring no structural weaknesses threatened the safety of the camp. Every step revealed subtle changes in the terrain, small fissures in the ground, rocks that had shifted, signs that the comet's lingering effects were still active. John, leaning on his staff, observed silently with a frown. He understood that nature, even when appearing calm, held unpredictable forces. Years of experience in disaster zones had taught him that vigilance was as critical as the physical fortifications they had built. The crater, though fertile and restorative, demanded constant attention. Midday brought new challenges, as a sudden electromagnetic storm flickered across the valley sky. Lightning arcs crackled faintly in the distance, causing minor static surges in the camp's makeshift communication devices. The survivors scrambled to secure equipment and shelters, following the safety protocols John had instituted. Nathan and Camille helped anchor the tents and reinforce weak walls with spare timber, learning firsthand how fragile safety could be in a post-apocalyptic world. Allison checked everyone's well-being, distributing water and monitoring for signs of panic. Even with John's limited energy, he moved to direct the most critical tasks, emphasizing efficiency and calm. By late afternoon, the storm subsided, leaving behind scorched patches of earth and a lingering electric hum. While the damage was minimal, the incident reminded the group that despite the valley's apparent stability, the world beyond still carried unpredictable dangers. As evening descended, the survivors gathered around a central fire, sharing stories to keep morale high. Nathan recounted tales of their escape from Liverpool and London, embellishing moments to make the younger children laugh. Camille offered small sketches she had drawn during the day, depicting animals and landscapes, a creative reprieve from the relentless tension. Allison watched her family, heart swelling with pride and concern, in equal measure. Every day brought small victories, but each one reminded her that the world they were building required endurance, ingenuity, and unrelenting vigilance. Even in moments of joy, there was awareness of the fragility of existence. John, though visibly weaker, spoke to the group with a steady voice, emphasizing cooperation, foresight, and adaptability. His presence, even diminished, provided guidance and stability. The survivors leaned on his experience, knowing that their long-term survival depended not just on the land, but on the wisdom passed down from those who had seen the collapse and the rebuilding firsthand. Over the next several days, the Garrities organized expeditions to map the valley and surrounding areas. They marked safe paths, noted food and water sources, and established lookout points. The natural barriers of the crater, cliffs, and lakes provided some security, but John stressed that they could not rely solely on geography to keep threats at bay. Nathan and Camille became adept at scouting, learning to identify subtle environmental cues that signaled danger, unusual animal behavior, shifts in wind patterns, or odd seismic vibrations. Their youthful energy and adaptability made them invaluable to these missions. Allison documented findings meticulously, creating a reference for both current use and future generations. The survivors began to form routines, a semblance of society emerging from the chaos. Cooperation, trust, and skill sharing became the currency of survival, ensuring that each individual's contribution mattered, and that no one was left vulnerable. Tensions inevitably arose when a small faction of newcomers challenged the Garrities' leadership. Their intentions were not malicious, but misunderstandings and fear led to disagreements over resource allocation and defense strategies. John and Allison addressed these conflicts with patience, listening to grievances and mediating resolutions that reinforced community cohesion. Nathan observed these interactions closely, learning that survival required diplomacy and empathy, not just physical strength. Camille, too, matured rapidly, understanding that maintaining harmony was as crucial as defending against environmental threats. Their education and leadership was unintentional but profound, ensuring that the next generation would be prepared for challenges beyond survival. Even amidst disputes, the overarching sense of purpose prevailed. The collective goal of rebuilding a safe, sustainable life in the crater remained the anchor for all decisions. Weeks passed, and the valley began to feel like home. Fields were cultivated successfully, water sources secured, and structures reinforced. The survivors became more self-reliant, each person finding a role that suited their abilities and contributed to the greater good. John, despite deteriorating health, continued to mentor and guide. He instructed on irrigation, structural reinforcement, and emergency response. Allison managed daily logistics, ensuring that everyone was fed, rested, and aware of safety protocols. Nathan and Camille served as scouts and messengers, their small size and agility allowing them to move quickly between areas. Even with the crater's relative safety, the Garrities knew the world outside remained unpredictable. Reports of distant electromagnetic disturbances, bandit movements, and seismic activity reminded them that vigilance would never cease. Life here required balance, celebrating small victories while preparing for unforeseen challenges. By late autumn, the community had established a small school for younger survivors, teaching basic skills, reading, and survival knowledge. Nathan and Camille helped instruct younger children, sharing lessons learned on scouting, navigation, and recognizing environmental hazards. Their efforts instilled hope that knowledge would pass to the next generation, ensuring continuity and resilience. Allison oversaw the curriculum, integrating practical survival skills with academic learning. John's health continued to decline, but his influence was evident in every decision, every plan, and every safety measure. His legacy, built through teaching and example, was firmly rooted in the community. Even as danger persisted beyond the crater, the Garrities nurtured a sense of normalcy, purpose, and stability. Their daily routines became rituals that reinforced unity, ensuring that both body and spirit remained strong. John, though weakened by radiation exposure, insisted on joining the perimeter check, leaning heavily on a staff and Nathan's support. "We can't let complacency set in," he rasped, his voice hoarse but resolute. Every creak of the trees, every whisper of the wind, became an assessment point. Was this ordinary, environmental noise or a precursor to danger? In this post-apocalyptic world, misreading signs could be fatal. Allison coordinated emergency drills for the survivors, reinforcing protocols for sudden storms, seismic tremors, or unanticipated intrusions. These exercises were both practical and psychological, building trust and competence across the group. Even the youngest members began to internalize safety measures, understanding through repetition that survival depended on readiness, awareness, and swift, coordinated action. By midday, the fog lifted to reveal a distant plume of smoke rising along the crater's northern ridge. Nathan squinted through binoculars and spotted a small convoy of survivors cautiously making their way toward the valley. Allison and John exchanged tense glances. The approach of outsiders meant potential allies, but also risk. History had shown them that desperation often breeds hostility, and every interaction could be the difference between life and death. The newcomers, a family of 4 with 2 adolescents, carried minimal supplies and wore tattered clothing, signs that they had survived harsh conditions to reach this fertile valley. Allison stepped forward with the most visible symbols of welcome: water, food, and a neutral stance, while John and Nathan maintained defensive positions at the edges of the open ground. Communication, both verbal and through body language, became a delicate dance. Too much aggression could provoke violence, too little caution could be exploited. Camille, ever observant, noticed subtle signs in the newcomers' movements, the wary glances, the careful steps, the repeated scanning of their surroundings. She whispered to Nathan, "They're scared, but not dangerous." Yet, Nathan nodded, realizing that instincts, honed over months of survival, were as crucial as weapons or physical strength in reading potential threats. After an extended negotiation and demonstration of goodwill, the newcomers were allowed into the crater under strict supervision. They were exhausted, malnourished, and wary, but the promise of shelter and safety slowly eased their tension. Allison guided them to the central camp, providing blankets and food, while ensuring that John's medical knowledge was available for any immediate health concerns. The integration process was meticulous. Every new individual had to undergo observation, participate in chores, and demonstrate adherence to established safety protocols. Nathan and Camille assisted with orientation, explaining which paths were safe, which areas were to be avoided, and how to respond to sudden environmental changes. These steps, though time-consuming, were essential in preventing conflict and maintaining the delicate balance of the valley community. John, despite his worsening condition, offered counsel on leadership and trust building. "We survive together," he said quietly. "But we thrive only if everyone respects the system we've built." His words carried weight, not because of authority alone, but because the community had witnessed firsthand his unwavering commitment to their safety and continuity. Over the next several days, the newly joined survivors began to acclimate, helping with farm work, fortifying shelters, and assisting with perimeter maintenance. The Garrities monitored every action carefully, ensuring no inadvertent damage or security breach occurred. The presence of more people meant more hands to share labor, but also increased responsibility for vigilance and coordination. Allison encouraged community meetings each evening, allowing everyone to discuss daily experiences, report anomalies, and voice concerns. This democratic approach reinforced trust and mutual respect, while providing insight into potential threats or needs that might otherwise be overlooked. Nathan and Camille acted as messengers, bridging communication between adults and younger members, further strengthening the community fabric. The valley, once an isolated refuge, began evolving into a sustainable micro-society. Each member, from the youngest to the oldest, contributed to a shared mission: survival with dignity, growth with foresight, and continuity, despite the chaotic forces still present beyond the crater. As the sun dipped below the crater walls, casting elongated shadows across the fields and forests, a distant tremor rattled the ground. Birds took flight in startled flocks, and the camp fell into anticipatory silence. John gripped his staff tighter, scanning the horizon while Allison secured essential supplies. The newcomers froze in place, learning in real time the subtle cues of danger that seasoned survivors recognized instantly. Nathan and Camille exchanged a knowing look, understanding that this tremor, though minor, was a reminder that the world outside still bore scars of the Clark comet's devastation. Allison reminded everyone to remain calm and follow protocol, reinforcing lessons drilled into them for months. Every precaution, every habit, every routine had been designed to ensure survival when unpredictability struck. As night fell, the valley returned to an uneasy quiet. Fires burned steadily, watch rotations were maintained, and the community slept in shifts, understanding that even in a restored area, vigilance was unending. This delicate balance between safety and awareness, trust and caution, became the defining rhythm of life in the crater. rhythm the Garrities were determined to preserve for themselves, and for the future generations they nurtured, pierced through lingering clouds over the crater, casting a pale golden light that glinted off the calm surface of the newly formed lakes. Nathan and Camille were already at the edge of a small field, carefully measuring the soil and cataloging the sprouting crops that had begun to thrive in the fertile crater ground, while Allison supervised the construction of elevated shelters designed to withstand sudden storms. John, though still pale from radiation, moved among them slowly, pointing out the safest paths across the uneven terrain and instructing the younger survivors on reading subtle environmental signs, wind direction, soil moisture, and tremor indicators that could signal seismic shifts. The valley, though serene in appearance, was a landscape still adjusting after the comet's devastation, and every minor detail demanded attention and respect. By mid-morning, the group gathered at the main water source to establish a rotating patrol schedule, ensuring the valley perimeter was monitored without exhausting any individual. The newcomers from Calais were incorporated into this schedule, their initial hesitation slowly replaced by cautious confidence. As Allison emphasized the importance of teamwork and adherence to protocol, Nathan and Camille demonstrated simple but crucial exercises, using binoculars for distant observation, marking unusual tracks, and identifying signs of radiation, pockets, or unstable terrain. John observed silently, his face a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that every skill the younger generation acquired could mean the difference between life and death in the unpredictable post-impact world. Meanwhile, tensions occasionally rippled beneath the surface. Some newcomers questioned the strict enforcement of rules, arguing that excessive caution slowed progress and limited exploration of potentially fertile zones beyond the crater. Allison addressed these concerns calmly, explaining that while curiosity was necessary for growth, survival depended on structure and precaution. She reminded the group that nature's volatility remained a constant threat, and that one misstep underestimating residual seismic activity or lingering radioactive zones could undo months of careful preparation. The conversation, though tense, ultimately reinforced the delicate balance of freedom and discipline required to thrive in this new world, and most reluctantly accepted the rationale, realizing that compliance was not a restriction but a lifeline. As the afternoon progressed, Allison organized a mapping exercise to chart the safe zones, noting both natural resources and hazardous areas. Nathan and Camille led small teams of adolescents to scout, each carrying rudimentary instruments salvaged from old settlements and improvised tools for measurement and marking. John followed at a distance, observing the exercise and occasionally providing insight on interpreting subtle signs changes in vegetation, unusual rock formations, or air ionization fluctuations that could signal environmental instability. The exercise was rigorous but vital, teaching the survivors to anticipate and respond to threats before they became immediate dangers, blending practical survival with ongoing education, ensuring knowledge continuity across generations. Near the edge of the crater, the sound of shifting rocks drew Allison's attention. A small cluster of displaced boulders had tumbled into a shallow ravine, revealing traces of old machinery buried beneath the soil. The discovery sparked discussion about scavenging opportunities versus the potential dangers of unstable remnants. Allison, John, and the most experienced adults carefully examined the area, identifying structural weaknesses and deciding which items could be safely retrieved. Nathan and Camille assisted with hauling lightweight pieces, learning to assess both value and risk simultaneously. These activities not only provided material resources, but reinforced critical thinking and risk management skills under realistic conditions. Evening fell, bringing a chill that cut through the valley's relative warmth. The group gathered around centralized fire pits, not only for warmth but to discuss the day's findings and reinforce safety protocols for night operations. Allison led a briefing on nocturnal hazards, explaining how reduced visibility amplified threats from both wildlife and environmental instability. John shared his observations from the scouting parties, emphasizing the importance of remaining alert and maintaining silent communication cues, particularly when patrolling perimeter zones. Camille and Nathan facilitated interactive exercises, challenging their peers to navigate short distances in near darkness, enhancing their awareness and reinforcing lessons in both navigation and teamwork. Late into the night, as the fires burned low and most of the survivors rested in secure shelters, Allison stayed with John, discussing the psychological impact of their long journey and the ongoing responsibility of leadership. They spoke quietly about the weight of decisions made, the lives saved and lost, and the subtle ways hope could be maintained even in a fractured world. Nathan and Camille, peeking through the small opening of their makeshift tents, watched their parents' conversation, and silently absorbed lessons on resilience, empathy, and strategic foresight. In a world where every day presented unpredictable challenges, these late-night reflections were as important as physical preparedness, instilling values and wisdom critical to the survival and cohesion of their community. The following morning, a distant tremor shook the valley subtly, barely perceptible, but enough to trigger the practiced alert systems. Nathan sounded the warning with a pre-arranged signal, prompting immediate response drills. Everyone moved swiftly to predetermined safe zones, demonstrating how months of preparation had honed reflexes and minimized panic. Allison coordinated from a central vantage, observing each group's performance and offering real-time adjustments, while John monitored tremor patterns and ground shifts, recording data for future reference. The exercise reaffirmed the importance of vigilance, teamwork, and structured contingency planning, transforming a moment of potential crisis into a practical training opportunity. Later, while repairing a segment of irrigation channels disrupted by minor landslides, the group heard the distant rumble of engines approaching from the valley's main entrance. A convoy of survivors, heavily armed and cautious, appeared over the ridge, signaling both opportunity and potential conflict. Allison immediately implemented the communication protocol established for unknown arrivals, instructing some members to display non-threatening signals while others took discreet defensive positions. Nathan and Camille observed the newcomers' movement patterns, noting subtle cues of both anxiety and intent. The newcomers' wary approach reflected their own experiences with scarcity and threat, underscoring a fundamental truth. In this new world, trust had to be earned, not assumed. Allison greeted the convoy cautiously, offering water and food as gestures of goodwill while maintaining a watchful eye. The newcomers, though initially skeptical, began to share information about remaining safe zones, resources, and environmental hazards beyond the crater. This exchange highlighted the importance of cooperation, balanced with the recognition that survival often required negotiation and careful discernment. Nathan and Camille assisted in documentation, marking territories, mapping potential routes, and assessing the newcomers' reliability. Each interaction, each observation, became a part of the ongoing learning process, shaping the way the crater community would grow, adapt, and defend itself in the months to come. As night returned, the crater valley glowed under a canopy of stars, reflecting in the lakes and casting elongated shadows across the fields. Fires burned steadily in clusters, signaling both activity and security, while watch rotations maintained vigilance over the perimeter. Allison and John reviewed maps, planning expansion, crop rotation, and resource management. Nathan and Camille helped reinforce shelters, reflecting on lessons learned that day about human behavior, trust, survival, and the unspoken rhythms of life in a valley shaped by catastrophe. In this fragile balance of hope and caution, the Garrities and their community continued to adapt, grow, and prepare for the unpredictable world outside, determined to ensure that survival evolved into sustainable life for all who had endured the cataclysm. The crater's outer edges held a strange, tense stillness as the group carefully moved through the undulating terrain, scanning for hazards and signs of lingering radiation. Nathan carried makeshift sensors, adjusting dials and noting readings while Camille traced routes on a worn map, marking rocky outcrops and potential water sources. Allison observed silently from higher ground, evaluating each movement and anticipating where dangers might emerge, from sudden fissures to unstable soil patches left by shifting terrain. The survivors' steps were measured, deliberate, reflecting both caution and an unspoken understanding that every decision could determine who reached the fertile interior safely. At one ridge, a minor collapse revealed an underground water channel, its murky flow alive with sediments and mineral traces. John approached cautiously, analyzing its source and velocity, pointing out weak points where erosion could destabilize adjacent soil. Nathan and Camille followed his instructions, inserting temporary supports and recording the channel's path for future irrigation planning. The group paused to consider the implications. The channel could provide both a reliable water supply and a hidden danger if left unmonitored. Allison coordinated teams to set up diversion barriers and inspection points, ensuring the feature would benefit the community without introducing risk. Further into the crater, the survivors encountered scattered remnants of a collapsed settlement, rusted beams, broken solar panels, and partially intact structures, reminders of previous attempts at colonization. Allison led the examination, directing Nathan and Camille to document salvageable resources. John evaluated structural integrity, identifying beams that could be repurposed and unstable walls that needed cautious dismantling. Each discovery became an opportunity whether for materials or knowledge, illustrating the delicate balance between leveraging what existed and avoiding the hazards of decay and instability. As they worked, distant low rumbles echoed through the crater walls, signaling minor seismic tremors. Nathan immediately checked sensor readings, while Camille noted corresponding cracks appearing in nearby slopes. Allison orchestrated a rapid safety drill, moving everyone to pre-designated safe zones and monitoring progress. John observed from a distance, noting patterns and comparing them to historical quake data, providing insight into how the crater's terrain responded to residual energy. Once the tremors subsided, survivors returned to their tasks, their movements now imbued with heightened awareness and caution, each decision sharpened by experience. In one sheltered alcove, Camille discovered a cluster of wild edible plants, previously unnoticed amidst rubble and ash. Allison encouraged careful collection, explaining the importance of identifying plants resilient to environmental extremes. Nathan suggested a plan for cultivating seeds in controlled plots, ensuring sustainability. John added technical advice on soil enrichment and nutrient cycling, emphasizing that successful foraging was inseparable from strategic agriculture. The survivors worked in unison, blending exploration with practical preparation, and slowly transformed the crater into a dynamic ecosystem where natural resources could be maximized while maintaining safety. Midday brought a sudden dust storm, swirling with fine ash carried from distant tectonic fractures. Visibility dropped to a few meters, forcing the group to rely on pre-planned signals and tactile guidance. Allison led from the center, ensuring everyone remained connected and protected from exposure. Nathan and Camille checked emergency respirators, reinforcing the importance of maintaining equipment under extreme conditions. The storm passed as abruptly as it began, leaving a thin layer of fresh ash across the crater floor. Survivors took stock, cleaning gear, adjusting shelters, and recalibrating sensors. The episode reinforced their adaptability and highlighted the ongoing tension between environmental unpredictability and structured survival measures. Later, the group encountered the skeletal remains of a tree uprooted by a landslide. John analyzed its orientation and root structure, explaining how erosion patterns could indicate vulnerable slopes nearby. Nathan and Camille marked the area on their maps, noting zones requiring reinforcement or avoidance. Allison emphasized the necessity of combining observation with practical intervention, assigning teams to strengthen embankments and construct diversion channels. The meticulous approach exemplified the group's philosophy. Survival demanded anticipation, methodical action, and a deep understanding of the altered environment, rather than simple reaction. By afternoon, communication lines were established with a distant survivor enclave beyond a ridge, revealing a network of individuals similarly striving to rebuild. Allison organized a strategy to exchange resources and share environmental data while maintaining security protocols. Nathan and Camille assisted in setting up temporary relays and signal flags, ensuring messages could be sent without exposing positions to potential threats. John provided technical oversight, adjusting frequencies and inspecting relay points for interference. The process not only enhanced the community's security, but also fostered morale, as survivors recognized the presence of others committed to the same goal of sustainable life after catastrophe. Evening shadows revealed wildlife cautiously returning to the crater. Small mammals, birds, and insects began to emerge, indicating a slow but steady recovery of the ecosystem. Allison led Nathan and Camille through careful observation exercises, teaching them how to interpret animal behavior as indicators of environmental stability. John explained correlations between species presence, water quality, and vegetation growth. The exercise reinforced the concept that survival was intertwined with ecological awareness, and that observation, documentation, and adaptation were critical skills. Night brought an unexpected rain, pooling in depressions and forming temporary channels. The group monitored these developments, adjusting irrigation plans and reinforcing embankments to prevent flooding. Allison coordinated efforts to collect water, assess quality, and store reserves for dry periods. Nathan and Camille participated in the operation, recording data and suggesting improvements based on earlier observations. John oversaw structural reinforcements to prevent erosion, emphasizing the long-term value of small, consistent interventions. The combined effort underscored the delicate balance between immediate survival and long-term planning, a recurring lesson for the group. By late night, the crater was illuminated by moonlight filtering through intermittent clouds, casting reflective glimmers across lakes and streams. Survivors gathered near central fire points, sharing experiences, observations, and strategies for further development. Allison reviewed daily reports, identifying strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities for improvement. Nathan and Camille prepared equipment and plotted scouting routes for the following day. John, though fatigued, conducted final checks on structural reinforcements and environmental sensors. The shared routines and collaborative reflection fostered cohesion, reinforcing both practical skills and the psychological resilience necessary for enduring a world still recovering from catastrophic upheaval. The first light of dawn caught the crater's edge in muted silver, highlighting the subtle ridges and cracks that ran across the terrain. Allison moved deliberately along a rocky incline, observing the patterns left by overnight rainfall and minor rock slides. By mid-morning, a distant rumble signaled a minor tremor cascading down a nearby slope. John, surveying the surrounding area from a higher vantage, raised his hand to halt the group. Rocks shifted underfoot, and a small plume of dust rose from a fissure, sending a warning echo across the crater walls. Allison directed Nathan and Camille to assist in securing a series of temporary barriers along vulnerable ledges. Each plank, rope, and reinforced support had to be positioned precisely. A single oversight could trigger collapse. The group worked methodically, their movements synchronized, combining experience with instinct, honed over years of catastrophe. Even the smallest gesture, placing a rope just so, shifting a plank, slightly held disproportionate significance, in a world where minor errors could cascade into disaster. The survivors paused to assess their progress, breathing heavily, but maintaining vigilance. Camille spotted a narrow ravine, partially obscured by overhanging rocks, its dark mouth suggesting a subterranean channel. John approached cautiously, examining sediment patterns and airflow from within. "This could lead to groundwater reservoirs," he murmured. "But we need to test for contamination before anyone enters." Nathan set up portable sensors at the entrance, while Allison marked safe distances and created quick exit points. The delicate balance between exploration and caution was evident. Uncovering resources was essential, yet one misstep could prove fatal. Around midday, clouds gathered, shifting shadows across the crater floor and softening the edges of distant ridges. A sudden wind gust carried loose soil and ash into the survivors' eyes, forcing immediate adjustments. Allison guided everyone to low-lying shelters, while Nathan recalibrated instruments to account for sudden shifts in wind velocity and dust density. Camille gathered plant samples displaced by the gust, noting their condition and potential for resilience. The episode was brief but instructive. Even subtle environmental shifts could disrupt careful planning, and constant observation was required to maintain stability. As the storm passed, the group discovered remnants of a collapsed observation post embedded in a shallow gully. Rusted metal and splintered wood hinted at a previous attempt to survey the crater, possibly from survivors unknown to them. John examined the structure's integrity, identifying components that could be salvaged for building supports or makeshift tools. Allison instructed Camille and Nathan to carefully extract usable materials, emphasizing structural safety and contamination risks. Each salvaged piece represented a dual value: utility for immediate survival and insight into prior human activity, suggesting both opportunities and cautionary tales. The afternoon brought a small band of wildlife, cautiously emerging from crevices and shadowed ledges. Rabbits, small birds, and insects that had adapted to the crater's transformed ecosystem. Allison encouraged the group to observe silently, recording behavior and interactions. Nathan hypothesized correlations between soil richness and species density, while Camille focused on documenting migration patterns. The exercise reinforced the principle that ecological intelligence, understanding how flora and fauna interacted with terrain, water, and climate, was as vital as technical skill. Later, a distant echo of machinery suggested other survivors in a nearby valley. Allison signaled for quiet, and the group approached carefully, mapping contours and noting possible approaches for contact. Nathan prepared signaling devices, while Camille constructed discrete observation points. John analyzed the ridgeline for natural cover and potential threats, emphasizing the necessity of maintaining readiness for sudden encounters. The team's cautious curiosity demonstrated their understanding that, even in a partially restored ecosystem, human unpredictability could rival environmental danger in severity. By late afternoon, the team reached a small natural plateau, where water pooled in shallow basins, reflecting fractured sunlight through thin cloud cover. Allison led the effort to analyze water purity, teaching Nathan and Camille methods for rapid chemical assessment. using portable kits. John reinforced embankments to prevent overflow into unstable areas, while Camille recorded every detail, from mineral content to runoff paths. These routines, though painstaking, were critical in establishing a sustainable foothold, ensuring the survivors could not only persist, but gradually transition from reactive survival to proactive settlement. Evening brought long shadows and an eerie silence as migratory birds began returning to the crater for rest. Allison convened a brief strategy meeting, reviewing sensor data, mapping risks, and identifying zones for immediate reinforcement. Nathan suggested new approaches to monitor fissures and soil movement, while Camille proposed planting hardy vegetation to stabilize slopes. John integrated these plans with structural supports, combining civil engineering principles with ecological observation. The group's collaboration highlighted a recurring theme. Survival relied on the seamless blending of science, observation, and human ingenuity. Nightfall delivered its own set of challenges. Sudden temperature drops, shifting winds, and isolated echoes that could indicate predator presence or structural instability. Allison led the deployment of perimeter alarms and shelters, ensuring each member could respond instantly to hazards. Nathan monitored environmental sensors, recording shifts in temperature, pressure, and seismic activity. Camille maintained logs and coordinated nightly rotations to guarantee constant vigilance. Even in rest, the survivors remained alert, their bodies and minds attuned to the subtleties of a world still reshaped by catastrophe. In the quiet of deep night, the crater revealed its reflective beauty. Pools glimmered under starlight, shadows danced across rugged cliffs, and the wind carried distant, haunting echoes. Allison, John, Nathan, and Camille gathered briefly at the central fire, sharing observations, strategies, and the occasional anecdote to maintain morale. Plans for the coming day were mapped, equipment checked, and mental preparedness reinforced. The rituals of observation, repair, and vigilance had become second nature, a testament to human resilience and adaptability in the face of relentless environmental upheaval. The Garrity family pressed onward across the jagged terrain, their feet sinking into the scorched earth. Every step a test of endurance, as distant rumbles reminded them of the planet's fragile equilibrium. Nathan's eyes darted to every shadow, every twisted remnant of human civilization, as if expecting danger to emerge from the cracked horizon. Allison gripped his shoulder firmly, her voice steadying him, despite her own mounting exhaustion, whispering instructions to navigate through unstable ground, without drawing attention to themselves. Dr. Amina's absence weighed heavily on their minds, her presence lost to the chaos of gunfire and sudden ambush, and yet her lessons lingered. Every improvised medical decision and resourceful maneuver they had shared became a lifeline in this unforgiving landscape. The family encountered remnants of vehicles overturned and charred, their twisted frames marking silent testimonies to the violence and panic that had swept the world in prior years. John's steps were calculated, his mind simultaneously assessing structural weaknesses in the broken terrain and plotting the safest path forward. A dance of vigilance and hope that seemed to define every movement. A sudden screech of metal against rubble cut through the tension, and Nathan instinctively ducked, clutching a makeshift satchel filled with salvaged supplies. Allison's eyes scanned the horizon for movement, noting the subtle shadows shifting over broken walls, remnants of towns long abandoned. Every sound, every faint whisper of wind over fractured structures, became a potential signal of bandits or desperate survivors. And the family moved as a unit, silent yet coordinated, learning again how to trust intuition over certainty. Crossing a narrow ravine, they found themselves hemmed in by jagged rocks that rose like guardians from the cracked earth. Yet the natural barrier offered both protection and peril. Nathan's gaze lingered on the precipice below, imagining the lives that had fallen before them, while Allison reinforced the ropes and makeshift harnesses they carried to ensure safety. The trek became a series of deliberate, meticulous maneuvers, each step a negotiation with the terrain itself, a silent contest against gravity and instability. As night fell into an indistinct darkness, the wind carried whispers of ash and distant clatter, yet the family's eyes adjusted to the subtle glow of exposed mineral deposits along the canyon walls. John led with measured pace, mapping the obstacles in his mind and teaching Nathan to observe the patterns of loose rocks and potential collapse points. Allison gathered water from a shallow stream, testing its clarity and strength, while Nathan learned the delicate balance of moving quickly but quietly, understanding that every noise could summon unintended threats. The approach to the crumbling outskirts of a former town revealed skeletal structures, hollowed shells of homes, stripped bare by storms and looters alike. Shadows clung to every corner, and the family advanced cautiously, each movement deliberate, measuring risk against the need for speed. Nathan's small hands gripped the strap of the satchel, sensing the importance of carrying their accumulated survival tools without burdening the others. While Allison reminded him softly that resourcefulness could outweigh fear when judgment was applied thoughtfully. An overturned truck caught John's attention, its rusted frame concealing a potential ambush or perhaps an opportunity for supplies. The family approached it with careful scrutiny, noticing the faint traces of recent footprints, and he gestured silently for Nathan to follow closely. Inside, they discovered a small cache of preserved rations, clean water bottles, and a partially functioning radio. The find bolstered their spirits, but John's eyes remained alert, scanning for signs that this provision might have a cost. Whether ambush or contamination, a reminder that trust in a world rebuilt from disaster was always conditional. Across the open stretch of ruined highway, the wind stirred clouds of ash and dust, giving the illusion of movement where none existed. And the Garrities adapted, moving between intermittent cover while monitoring every shift in the terrain. Nathan's youthful energy was tempered by the silent lessons of survival, learning to pace himself, conserve his strength, and prioritize observation over impulsive curiosity. Allison's leadership maintained cohesion, blending authority with empathy, guiding both her husband and son through each decision, a balance of strategy and protection that had become indispensable. Suddenly, a low rumble vibrated beneath their feet, resonating through fractured concrete and rock, and John halted, signaling silence. The family crouched, attuning their ears to the irregular cadence of distant machinery, engines, and the faint metallic ring that suggested movement beyond the immediate area. Their hearts synchronized with the rhythm of uncertainty, every decision now influenced by the presence of others who may or may not be hostile, testing their patience, judgment, and the unspoken bonds that kept them moving forward. As they maneuvered toward a shadowed overpass, remnants of signage half buried in ash hinted at towns swallowed by the upheaval. Yet the landscape also offered fleeting signs of regrowth, small shoots of green, resilient flora emerging from nutrient-poor soil. These glimpses of renewal reminded Allison that survival was not merely a matter of endurance, but also of hope, that each cautious step carried the possibility of discovering pockets of life and rebuilding what had been lost. Nathan's gaze followed her reflections, internalizing the idea that even amidst destruction, adaptation and resilience could shape a path forward, bridging the gaps between despair and the faint glimmers of promise. The Garrities moved through the remnants of a collapsed bridge, its twisted steel and jagged concrete threatening to ensnare any misstep. And John's careful pacing ensured Nathan and Allison stayed close, yet unimpeded. Each step across the unstable beams required trust in the material and in one another, a coordination born of necessity, where hesitation could mean injury or worse. Dust and debris filled the air, every inhalation a reminder that even survival came at a cost, and every moment demanded full attention. Beyond the bridge, the terrain opened to a wasteland of fractured highways and toppled buildings, a chaotic maze that offered both concealment and vulnerability. Shadows shifted across the broken landscape, hinting at lurking dangers. Yet the family adapted quickly, reading signs of past human movement, discarded tools, and makeshift shelters. Nathan learned to distinguish between safe ground and potential collapse, his youthful agility tempered by lessons in patience and observation, while Allison's calm guidance balanced urgency with caution. A distant rumble signaled the passage of a scavenger convoy, and John led the family behind a cluster of derelict vehicles, their rusted frames offering imperfect cover. Through a gap in the wreckage, they observed armed survivors moving with precision, coordinating to secure resources with little regard for those they displaced. The Garrities remained hidden, assessing patterns and calculating safe passage, understanding that confrontation could be fatal. Yet the knowledge gained from observation provided strategic advantage for the next leg of their journey. As they moved past the convoy's path, Allison noticed a narrow alley, partially shielded by a fallen wall, and she directed the family toward it with subtle gestures. Inside, a small cache of canned food and water bottles lay partially concealed beneath rubble, remnants of another survivor's attempt to secure essentials. John examined the contents carefully, ensuring nothing was contaminated, while Nathan carefully added the items to their satchel. Each resource gained to reinforce the delicate balance between risk and reward that defined life after catastrophe. The family pressed onward, navigating through areas where structures leaned precariously and steel beams jutted outward like jagged teeth. Wind currents carried clouds of ash that clung to their clothing and hair, masking scents and muffling sounds, yet also serving as an obstacle to clear visibility. Every cautious movement was calculated, a blend of instinct and learned skill. And Nathan began to anticipate his father's gestures and signals, internalizing the silent language of survival that could mean life or death. Crossing a ravine littered with remnants of long-abandoned vehicles, the family encountered a shallow stream, its water surprisingly clear despite the surrounding destruction. Allison knelt, testing it carefully, ensuring it was safe to drink, while John monitored the surroundings for potential threats. Nathan, watching his parents' meticulous approach, understood the importance of prudence and preparation, realizing that the smallest oversight could lead to catastrophic consequences in this new world. As they continued, distant echoes of gunfire and shouting suggested conflict nearby, yet the family avoided confrontation, weaving through narrow passageways and broken streets with minimal exposure. Their pace was deliberate, measured, guided by the need to conserve energy, avoid detection, and maintain focus on the ultimate destination. Each decision, from route selection to timing movement, reinforced their growing understanding of strategy and cooperation under extreme conditions. Emerging from a collapsed overpass, the Garrities encountered a small band of survivors, wary, armed, and desperate. Negotiation was tense, words exchanged in hushed tones as Allison stepped forward to establish trust. Offering some of their gathered supplies as a gesture of goodwill, Nathan observed the interaction, learning firsthand that diplomacy and empathy could be as crucial to survival as vigilance or physical skill. And John remained ready to intervene if the encounter turned hostile. With careful compromise, the survivors shared information about routes leading closer to the crater region, describing areas that had been fortified against wandering bandits and dangerous terrain. Each detail was crucial. Allison and John memorized every path, obstruction, and potential danger, while Nathan recorded landmarks mentally, reinforcing situational awareness. Knowledge became a form of currency in this fractured world, and even fleeting alliances were valuable for advancing toward safety. The family moved again, guided by new intelligence and cautious optimism, traversing barren fields, scarred by seismic activity and radioactive fallout. Their journey was punctuated by moments of silent reflection, recognizing both the devastation of the past and the glimmers of regeneration. In the sparse vegetation reclaiming pockets of earth, every observation reminded them that survival required adaptability, foresight, and the determination to protect one another while navigating a world forever altered by catastrophe. The Garrities advanced carefully along a broken railway corridor where twisted tracks curved through shattered hillsides, and the metallic skeletons of abandoned trains stood frozen like monuments to the old world. John studied the path ahead with the instincts of a scout who had survived countless dangers, guiding Allison and Nathan through narrow gaps between wreckage where one wrong step could trigger collapse. Nathan followed closely, adjusting the weight of their pack while absorbing every lesson his father silently demonstrated. Further ahead, the railway cut through a narrow canyon of cracked stone, its walls marked by scorch patterns left from earlier electromagnetic storms that had swept across the continent. The ground vibrated faintly under their feet as distant tectonic shifts reminded them that the planet itself had not yet settled after the comet's devastation. Allison kept scanning the ridgelines above, aware that elevated ground could hide watchers or snipers, and every shadow felt like a potential threat. When the path opened into a deserted industrial zone, towering smokestacks and broken warehouses stretched across the horizon, silent and rusting. The family moved between the structures cautiously, pausing frequently to listen for movement beyond the creaking of wind against sheet metal. Nathan noticed faded signs hanging from cracked walls, and imagined the lives that once filled the place with noise and purpose. Realizing how completely the disaster had erased the past. Inside one warehouse, the Garrities discovered remnants of a long-abandoned relief station, with scattered medical crates and rusted cots still arranged in orderly rows. Allison searched through the containers carefully, retrieving bandages and sealed medication that could still prove useful on their journey. John reinforced the barricade at the entrance, while Nathan helped organize the supplies. And for a brief moment the quiet shelter allowed them to breathe, without fear of immediate pursuit. Leaving the warehouse behind, they crossed a dry canal, where the concrete bed had fractured into uneven plates that tilted like fallen dominoes. The emptiness of the channel amplified every sound, forcing them to move slowly, to avoid echoing footsteps that might carry far beyond their location. Nathan climbed carefully over a massive slab, while John offered a steady hand, reminding him that patience was more valuable than speed in terrain like this. Beyond the canal, the remains of a small settlement appeared, its houses half buried beneath dust and creeping vegetation that had begun reclaiming the land. The Garrities approached cautiously, checking windows and doorways for signs of life before entering the main street. Allison noticed faint smoke drifting from the far end of the settlement, evidence that someone else had recently passed through the area. As they investigated further, they encountered a lone survivor repairing a small wind-powered generator beside a crumbling house. The man's wary expression softened slightly when Allison spoke calmly, explaining their journey and the rumors drawing them toward the crater region. After a tense pause, he shared limited information about patrol routes and safe corridors, warning them that bandit groups had grown more aggressive as resources became scarce. The Garrities listened carefully, committing every detail to memory before continuing their path across the outskirts of the settlement. John thanked the man, with a nod before guiding his family onward, aware that trust in this world was fragile and temporary. Nathan glanced back once before the houses disappeared behind them, realizing how many solitary survivors were scattered across the ruins of civilization. Their route eventually climbed toward a wide plateau where fractured wind turbines stood like silent guardians across the barren landscape. The machines no longer turned, their blades broken or buried in debris from past storms that had swept across the region. Allison felt the wind pushing steadily against them as they crossed the exposed ground, making the journey physically exhausting but offering clear visibility for miles. From the plateau's edge, they could see the distant horizon stretching toward the direction of France, where the rumored safe zone surrounding the impact crater continued to draw survivors from every corner of the shattered world. John studied the route ahead carefully, tracing possible paths through valleys and abandoned infrastructure that might provide cover from hostile groups. Nathan followed his father's gaze and imagined what life might look like if the stories about fertile land and rebuilding communities were true. Descending from the plateau, the Garrities entered a forest that had somehow survived the catastrophe, though many trees stood scarred and twisted by radiation storms. The quiet here felt different from the empty wastelands behind them, as faint sounds of wildlife hinted that nature had begun adapting to the altered environment. Allison allowed herself a moment of cautious hope, realizing that if life could return here, perhaps humanity could rebuild as well. As night approached, they located a sheltered hollow between massive tree roots, where the ground offered natural protection from wind and visibility. Nathan watched carefully as his father assembled the simple system, committing every step to memory because knowledge had become the most valuable tool in the world they now lived in, while sharing a small meal from their remaining supplies. The family spoke quietly about the journey ahead and the possibility of finally reaching the rumored valley near the crater. Allison reminded Nathan that survival was not only about endurance, but also about protecting the values that made rebuilding civilization possible. John listened silently for a moment, before assuring them that whatever waited ahead, they would face it together as they always had. Their brief rest ended when distant engine sounds echoed through the forest, forcing the Garrities to extinguish their small lantern and remain perfectly still among the shadows. The rumbling vehicles passed along a nearby road, their headlights sweeping through the trees like searching eyes before fading into the distance. Nathan held his breath the entire time, realizing how easily a moment of carelessness could expose them to danger. Once the sounds disappeared, John carefully dismantled the alarm and signaled that it was time to move again before dawn revealed their position. The forest path ahead curved through uneven terrain that required slow, deliberate movement to avoid loose ground and hidden obstacles. Allison walked beside Nathan, encouraging him quietly as the journey grew more exhausting with every mile. Eventually, the trees thinned and the landscape opened into a vast plain, where the ground was scarred by deep fissures left by the comet's impact shockwaves. Crossing the plain would leave them exposed, but it was also the most direct route toward the coastline where they hoped to find passage across the former English Channel. John studied the terrain carefully before committing to the crossing, knowing that hesitation could waste precious time and resources. As they stepped onto the open ground, strong winds carried fine ash across the surface, swirling in patterns that reduced visibility and coated everything with gray dust. The family wrapped cloth around their faces to protect their lungs, while maintaining a steady pace across the unstable terrain. Nathan struggled briefly against the wind before adjusting his stride, demonstrating the resilience he had developed through years of hardship. Halfway across the plain, they discovered the skeletal remains of a military convoy scattered across the fissured earth, vehicles overturned and half buried by shifting ground. John inspected the wreckage cautiously and managed to salvage a small radio transmitter that might still function with repairs. Allison watched the horizon carefully, while Nathan helped gather useful components, aware that every tool could increase their chances of survival. When they finally reached the far side of the plain, the distant outline of a vast dried seabed stretched before them, where the English Channel had once separated two nations. The sight filled them with both awe and uncertainty, because the crossing would expose them to days of travel with little natural cover. Yet beyond that barren expanse lay France, and beyond France, the crater, where rumors said the earth itself had healed. John rested his hand on Nathan's shoulder, while Allison gazed across the windswept wasteland. And for a moment, the three of them stood silently together, at the edge of the old world's boundary. The journey had already taken everything from them, except their determination to survive and protect each other. With renewed resolve, they stepped forward toward the dry channel, continuing the long migration that might finally lead them to a place where humanity could begin again. The Garrities stepped carefully onto the vast dry basin that had once been the English Channel. The endless stretch of cracked earth and drifting sand replacing what used to be one of the busiest waterways on the planet. Strong winds swept across the exposed seabed, carrying thin clouds of dust that moved like ghostly waves over the ground. Nathan stared across the enormous wasteland in silence, realizing that the scale of destruction was even greater than he had imagined. The surface beneath their boots shifted between hardened clay and loose sand that had gathered in long ridges shaped by years of relentless wind. John studied the terrain closely, while guiding their path along the most stable sections, avoiding areas where the ground might collapse into hidden cavities beneath the crust. Allison walked beside Nathan, reminding him to conserve his strength, because the crossing would take days before they reached the French coastline. Far in the distance, fragments of rusted ships lay half buried in the dust, like forgotten monuments to a vanished ocean. Their skeletal hulls creaked occasionally as the wind pushed against them, creating eerie sounds that echoed across the barren expanse. Nathan kept glancing at the silent vessels, imagining the moment when the sea must have disappeared and left them stranded forever on dry land. Hours passed as the family advanced deeper into the wasteland, their footsteps leaving faint tracks that quickly vanished beneath drifting dust. The sun hung behind a pale sky, filtered by lingering ash high in the atmosphere, creating a dim and colorless light that made distance difficult to judge. John remained alert for any movement across the open terrain, knowing that travelers crossing the basin could easily become targets. Near the wreckage of an overturned cargo ship, they discovered the remains of a temporary camp that had clearly been abandoned in a hurry. Torn tents fluttered weakly against broken masts, while scattered containers suggested that other survivors had attempted the same dangerous crossing before them. Allison searched the area carefully and recovered sealed food packs and a small water filtration unit that would extend their limited supplies. As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant rumbling sound rolled across the basin, vibrating faintly through the ground beneath their feet. John immediately recognized the warning signs of shifting tectonic plates beneath the weakened crust of the seabed. Without hesitation, he directed Allison and Nathan toward a cluster of partially buried ship containers that offered some protection from collapsing ground. Moments later, the earth trembled violently as deep cracks tore across the surface of the basin, sending clouds of dust spiraling into the air. Nathan gripped the edge of a container while trying to maintain his balance as the tremor continued for several long seconds. When the shaking finally stopped, a wide fissure stretched across the path they had been following only moments earlier. The near disaster forced them to alter their route, moving further west where the terrain appeared more stable despite the longer distance. John carefully mapped their new path, using landmarks created by the scattered shipwrecks across the basin. Nathan followed closely, understanding that every decision his father made carried the weight of survival. Late in the day, they spotted faint movement on the horizon that quickly resolved into a small convoy of vehicles, slowly crossing the basin in the opposite direction. The Garrities immediately took cover behind the rusted hull of a grounded tanker, observing the convoy through narrow gaps in the metal. Allison noticed the armed figures riding on top of the vehicles and recognized the signs of a heavily organized raider group. The convoy passed several hundred meters away without noticing them, its engines fading slowly into the distance while the family remained hidden in silence. Nathan finally exhaled once the sound disappeared, realizing how easily the encounter could have turned deadly in such an exposed landscape. John reminded them quietly that patience and caution were often the only advantages left in a world filled with desperate survivors. Night fell over the basin with a sudden drop in temperature that forced them to seek shelter inside the hollow remains of a broken ship hull. The metal structure provided protection from the relentless wind, while also concealing their presence from distant observers. Allison prepared a small meal using their salvaged supplies, while John reinforced the entrance with loose debris to prevent unexpected visitors. Nathan lay awake for a while, staring at the curved metal ceiling above him and listening to the distant howl of wind across the empty seabed. He thought about the stories of the crater valley they had heard from other survivors and wondered if those rumors truly described a place where life was beginning again. Despite the uncertainty, The idea of reaching such a place gave him the strength to keep moving forward. The following day began with a difficult climb across a series of ridges formed by ancient underwater cliffs, now exposed to the open air. The terrain forced them to move slowly along narrow paths where loose rocks threatened to send them sliding down steep slopes. John led the way carefully while Allison stayed close behind Nathan, ensuring that he maintained steady footing on the unstable ground. At the top of the highest ridge, the Garrities finally saw the distant outline of the French coastline, rising faintly through the dusty haze. The sight brought a rare moment of hope, as they realized they had nearly completed the dangerous crossing of the former sea. Nathan smiled faintly while adjusting his pack, knowing that each step now carried them closer to the rumored sanctuary near the crater. Their descent toward the coastline revealed signs that other groups had recently traveled the same path, including footprints and discarded equipment scattered along the route. Allison studied the tracks carefully and estimated that several dozen survivors might have passed through the area within the last few days. The discovery suggested that the rumors of a safe region in France was spreading across the devastated continent. As they approached the shore, the ground gradually transformed from cracked seabed into rough coastal plains, where patches of stubborn vegetation had begun reclaiming the soil. The faint green growth was the first sign of thriving plant life they had seen in weeks, offering quiet evidence that parts of the environment were slowly healing. Nathan touched one of the small plants with cautious curiosity, amazed that life could survive even after the world had nearly ended. Beyond the plain stood the ruined outskirts of Calais, where shattered buildings and collapsed roads marked the border between the empty basin and the battered remains of Europe. Smoke drifted faintly above the distant structures, hinting that survivors still occupied the city despite its destruction. John studied the skyline carefully before leading his family toward the outskirts with measured caution. Entering the edge of the city, they moved silently through streets filled with abandoned vehicles and broken glass that crunched beneath their boots. Allison kept watch on the rooftops while Nathan followed close behind his father, absorbing every movement as another lesson in survival. The silence of the ruined city felt tense, as if unseen eyes were observing their arrival. Their suspicion proved correct when a small group of armed survivors emerged from behind barricades further down the street, blocking the path deeper into the city. The group demanded to know where the Garrities had come from and what their intentions were in the territory they controlled. John stepped forward calmly, explaining their journey and their goal of reaching the crater region, where humanity was rumored to be rebuilding. After a tense exchange, the group's leader lowered his weapon slightly and studied the exhausted travelers standing before him. He explained that many survivors had recently passed through Calais on the same path toward the crater, confirming that the rumors spreading across the continent were likely true. Though wary, the group allowed the Garrities to pass through the city in exchange for a portion of their salvaged supplies. As the family continued deeper into the ruined streets, Nathan glanced back at the guarded barricade fading behind them. The encounter reminded him that even among survivors, trust had become a fragile and temporary thing. Yet, despite the dangers ahead, the path toward the crater now felt more real than ever. Beyond the shattered city limits, the road stretched toward the interior of France, where distant hills marked the direction of the massive impact crater that had reshaped the world. John paused for a moment while adjusting his pack and studying the horizon ahead. Then, with quiet determination, the Garrities continued forward into the unknown, moving one step closer to the place where their long migration might finally reach its end. The journey through northern France quickly revealed signs that the world was beginning to change again. Small patches of vegetation appeared between the broken concrete, stubborn plants pushing their way through soil that had once been poisoned by ash and radiation. Allison noticed the shift in the environment immediately, quietly pointing out the healthy leaves to Nathan as proof that nature was slowly recovering. John studied the land carefully as they walked, constantly scanning for threats, while also observing how the terrain was evolving after years of destruction. Streams of clear water flowed through shallow channels that had formed during the endless storms following the comet impact. Seeing clean water again felt like witnessing a miracle after surviving years surrounded by contaminated land. The Garrities followed the old highway deeper into the countryside until they reached a small farming village that had been partially rebuilt from the ruins. Wooden barricades blocked the road while watchtowers made from salvaged metal overlooked the surrounding fields. Smoke rose from several chimneys, confirming that survivors had established a permanent settlement in the area. A group of armed guards stepped forward cautiously as the family approached the village entrance. Their weapons remained lowered, but their expressions showed the careful suspicion that had become normal in this harsh new world. John calmly explained their journey and their destination, while Allison and Nathan waited quietly beside him. After listening to their story, the guards allowed the Garrities inside the settlement under close observation. The village itself revealed a surprising level of organization, with repaired houses, small crop fields, and carefully protected water wells placed throughout the area. Nathan watched farmers working the soil with simple tools, amazed that people were successfully growing food again. One of the village elders approached the family and offered them a place to rest for the night in exchange for helping repair part of the defensive wall that had been damaged during a recent storm. John immediately agreed, grateful for the chance to rest while also contributing something useful to the community. Nathan joined him without hesitation, determined to prove that he was strong enough to carry his share of responsibility. Throughout the afternoon, they worked alongside the villagers, stacking reinforced metal panels and rebuilding sections of the protective barrier surrounding the settlement. The cooperative effort reminded Allison of how society had once functioned before everything collapsed. For a brief moment, the village felt like a glimpse of the world they had lost. As evening approached, the elder invited the Garrities to share a simple meal prepared from the crops grown in nearby fields. Fresh vegetables and bread made from harvested grain were placed on the wooden table, a rare luxury in a world where most survivors still relied on scavenged supplies. Nathan ate slowly, realizing it had been years since he had tasted food grown in healthy soil. During the meal, the villagers shared stories about travelers passing through their settlement on the long road toward the crater. Many had described the same rumors about fertile valleys forming near the massive impact site where the comet had struck Earth. According to those reports, large military forces were guarding the area, while organized communities were beginning to grow there. John listened carefully to every detail, while quietly calculating the remaining distance they still had to travel. The crater region was still hundreds of kilometers away, but hearing consistent reports from different survivors strengthened his belief that the destination truly existed. For the first time in years, the possibility of a stable future felt almost within reach. Later that night, the Garrities rested inside a small wooden house offered by the villagers. The structure was simple but sturdy, with repaired walls that protected them from the cold wind outside. Nathan lay on a rough bed, staring at the ceiling beams, thinking about the families who were slowly rebuilding their lives across the continent. Morning arrived with quiet activity throughout the village, as farmers and guards prepared for another day of work. Before leaving, the elder handed Allison a small cloth bag filled with dried seeds harvested from their fields. He explained that, if the rumors about the crater valley were true, those seeds might help them start new crops once they arrived. The gift carried a powerful meaning that went far beyond simple supplies. It represented hope, the belief that humanity could still plant something today that would grow tomorrow. Allison thanked the elder sincerely before carefully storing the seeds in her pack. The Garrities continued their journey southward along the old highway as the rebuilt village slowly disappeared behind them. The land ahead rose gradually into rolling hills where scattered forests were beginning to grow again. Nathan noticed birds flying overhead, another sign that life was slowly returning to the damaged planet. Their progress through the countryside remained cautious as they passed through abandoned towns and silent highways, where the past still lingered in broken buildings. Occasionally they encountered other travelers, heading toward the same destination, exchanging brief conversations that confirmed the growing legend of the Crater Valley. One afternoon, the distant sound of gunfire echoed across the hills ahead, instantly forcing the Garrities to seek cover among the ruins of a collapsed farmhouse. John observed the area carefully through a pair of salvaged binoculars, while Allison and Nathan waited silently beside him. Across the valley below them, two armed groups were engaged in a violent confrontation over control of a narrow bridge crossing a river. The bridge clearly served as a critical route toward the southern regions where the crater territory lay. Vehicles burned along the roadside, while gunshots continued to echo through the hills. John knew immediately that the safest option was to avoid the battle entirely. He guided his family along a hidden path through nearby forested slopes that allowed them to bypass the dangerous crossing point. The detour added several hours to their journey, but survival had always depended on choosing patience over unnecessary risk. By nightfall they reached the far side of the valley, where the road continued south, toward the distant mountains that surrounded the massive impact crater. Nathan looked back toward the faint glow of fires still burning behind them, and felt grateful that they had escaped another deadly encounter. The landscape gradually transformed again as they moved closer to the region affected directly by the comet impact years earlier. Large ridges of fractured rock appeared across the terrain, where shockwaves had reshaped the ground during the disaster, despite the scars left behind by the collision. Small lakes of clean water had formed in several craters scattered across the land. The presence of fresh water attracted animals that had somehow survived the collapse of civilization. Nathan spotted deer moving cautiously through the hills, while birds gathered near the lakes to drink. Seeing wildlife thriving again strengthened the belief that the rumors about fertile land near the crater might actually be true. As the sun faded behind the distant mountains, the Geraghties stopped on a ridge, overlooking a vast valley stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay the massive crater that had changed the fate of humanity forever. John studied the distant peaks quietly, while adjusting the straps of his pack. The journey had already taken them across ruined cities, dry oceans, and endless danger. But the final destination was now closer than it had ever been before. Without speaking, the family continued forward together into the darkening landscape, moving steadily toward the place where their long migration might finally lead to a new beginning. The mountains surrounding the impact region rose like a massive wall across the horizon, their jagged peaks carved by the unimaginable force that had struck Earth years earlier. The Geraghties climbed the rocky slopes slowly, their bodies exhausted from months of travel, but their determination stronger than ever. Every step brought them closer to the destination that survivors across the world had been whispering about. The air in the highlands felt strangely different from the poisoned environments they had crossed. Earlier in their journey, instead of the constant smell of ash and chemical residue, a faint scent of wet soil drifted through the wind. Allison noticed the change first, breathing deeply as if her lungs were finally allowed to remember what clean air felt like. Nathan followed closely behind his parents, while carefully navigating the steep rocks scattered along the mountain trail. His legs ached from the endless walking, but the thought of reaching the safe valley kept pushing him forward. The stories they had heard from travelers replayed constantly in his mind, filling him with cautious hope. As they reached the highest ridge overlooking the crater region, the massive landscape below slowly revealed itself. The Geraghties stopped in silence, unable to fully process what they were seeing. The enormous impact crater that had once been a symbol of global destruction had transformed into something completely unexpected. Green fields stretched across the valley floor, where the ocean had once crashed violently into the coastline years ago. Freshwater lakes reflected sunlight across the land, while scattered forests had begun to grow along the edges of the fertile ground. The toxic clouds and violent electromagnetic storms that had plagued the planet for years were completely absent in this protected basin. Nathan stared at the valley in disbelief, struggling to understand how such a peaceful environment could exist in a world that had been destroyed. Small settlements dotted the landscape, their structures built carefully between rows of farmland. Smoke from cooking fires rose peacefully into the clear sky. John stood quietly beside his family, while observing the valley below, a mixture of relief and disbelief crossing his tired face. The rumors had been true all along. Humanity had finally found a place where life could begin again, without the constant threat of storms and radiation poisoning. Their moment of quiet hope was interrupted by the distant sound of engines climbing the mountain road behind them. A convoy of armored vehicles appeared along the ridge, carrying soldiers responsible for protecting the crater region from outside threats. The vehicles stopped several meters away, as armed guards stepped out cautiously. A military officer approached the Geraghties, while carefully studying them through protective gear designed for contaminated environments. John calmly explained their journey from Greenland, and the countless obstacles they had overcome to reach this place. The officer listened silently, while scanning the horizon behind them for any sign of danger. After a long moment of consideration, the officer finally nodded and signaled for the soldiers to lower their weapons. Travelers arriving from distant regions had become increasingly common, as news of the valley spread across the world. The Geraghties were not the first survivors to make the dangerous journey, but every new arrival reminded the defenders why they continued protecting the region. The soldiers escorted the family down the winding road that led from the mountain ridge into the heart of the crater valley. As they descended, the signs of rebuilding civilization became even more visible. Irrigation systems carried clean water through rows of crops, while workers harvested vegetables from healthy soil. Nathan watched children running across open fields near the settlement, something he had not seen since before the comet struck Earth. Their laughter echoed through the valley, as families gathered outside wooden homes built along the lake shores. For the first time in years, the world felt almost normal again. However, the long journey had taken a heavy toll on John's body. The radiation exposure he had endured during years of scouting missions had been silently weakening him. Throughout the descent into the valley, he struggled to hide the pain growing inside his chest. Allison noticed the change immediately when John began walking slower with every step. His breathing grew heavier while he leaned slightly against nearby rocks to steady himself. Nathan quickly moved beside him, concerned by the exhaustion spreading across his father's face. The convoy finally reached a peaceful clearing overlooking the valley's largest freshwater lake. Beyond the lake, wide fields stretched toward a sheltered forest where new communities were beginning to grow. It was exactly the kind of place where humanity could finally rebuild the future. John stopped walking near the edge of the clearing, his strength fading as the long struggle finally caught up with him. Allison rushed to support him, while Nathan knelt beside them, fear growing in his eyes as he realized what was happening. Despite the pain, John looked out across the valley with a calm expression filled with quiet satisfaction. Everything he had fought for, every dangerous decision he had made, had led them to this moment. His family had reached safety. He gently placed his hand on Nathan's shoulder while speaking slowly, reminding him that the journey had always been about protecting the next generation. The world they had known was gone, but a new one was waiting to be built by people brave enough to keep moving forward. Nathan struggled to hold back tears while listening to his father's final words. He understood now that survival alone had never been the true goal. The purpose of their journey had always been to create the possibility of a better life beyond the destruction. John's strength faded quietly as he looked one final time across the green valley, stretching toward the distant horizon. The sight of fertile land, peaceful water, and clear skies confirmed that humanity still had a future worth fighting for. Moments later, the long journey that had carried the Garrity family across a shattered world finally came to an end. John Garrity closed his eyes peacefully, knowing that Allison and Nathan had reached a place where they could finally begin again. As the evening light spread across the valley, Allison and Nathan stood together beside the lake, overlooking the growing settlements around them. The seeds given to them by the village elder remained safely inside Allison's pack, waiting to be planted in the rich soil of their new home. The world had been destroyed once, but humanity had not disappeared with it. In the quiet valley formed by the comet's impact, survivors from across the planet were slowly rebuilding everything that had been lost. And for the first time since the sky had fallen years ago, the future no longer looked like an endless struggle.